Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the long-awaited September webinar. For some reason, it seems like ages since we had the last webinar, and I have green lights on my end, so you should be seeing and hearing me. For those of you that are new, I believe we may have some new people on. On the right-hand side of your screen, you have a live chat box. You can see I've typed a little greeting in there. That's how we can interact. You can ask questions, make comments. There's little emojis if you're into doing smiley faces and things like that. And in addition, if any of you are watching on your desktop and you feel like you want to send me an email or something, I've got my phone here, and you can just go ahead and shoot me an email, and even though I have the sound off, I should be able to see the notification that you've sent me a note, or somebody sent me a note, and I can check it out. So there's a couple ways that we can communicate there, so enjoy. And what I wanted to talk about tonight is really timely with everything going on with healthcare, with all the fiery rhetoric that's going on, especially with Trump's speech at the United Nations. And we've talked about the idea of freedom a lot. And I think what we don't do a good job of as progressives is think in terms of freedom and what that means to issues, and how that's really, really different from the conservative view of freedom. So what I want to do tonight is start off with number one, look at kind of what the basis of the conservative view of freedom is, and then how we can change that and evoke the progressive idea of freedom, which, as I think all of you know by now, is very different in what that's based on, how that relates to our values, and then look at that on some specific issues, including healthcare and others. And I believe very strongly that what you're going to find is that when you start talking about freedom in the progressive frame, and evoking that idea with issues, that can be very motivating for people and actually give them something to believe in and hopefully to fight for. So away we go. So the foundation of authority in the conservative frame is this idea of a hierarchy. And why is that important to freedom? It's important to freedom because the authority figure defines freedom in the conservative frame. So to understand freedom in the conservative frame, you have to understand this idea of hierarchy and what it's based on. And this is critical to public perception of authority in the conservative frame. So you kind of see there, I've got the hierarchy kind of outlined from top to bottom. So in the conservative frame, this idea of God is at the top. God is over everything. So thus the extremist religions of, again, any religion, extremists in any religion tend to be evoking conservative ideas, the conservative frame. So there's consistency there in terms of what's authoritarian and the hierarchy. God is above everything. And then directly beneath God is this idea of man, and then also wealth and the market. If you recall, when you're talking about things like economics and prosperity and success and things like that, that the market is the decider. The market is a moral function, and the market can discipline people. The market can reward people, and people who are successful in the market, in the conservative frame, are thought of as being very moral because they have to have been disciplined to achieve their success, and therefore that puts them very high up on the hierarchy. And of course, wealth is related to market. So then below that is this idea of the United States, Christians, and white people being above other nations, non-Christians, non-whites, as you can see there. And then kind of getting towards the bottom, you have nature. That's a great question, Don. And yes, I've talked to a lot of people that I know who are in religion. Some of them lead congregations. Some of them are involved in connecting multi-denominational religious groups to communities and policy. And what's really clear is that when you're talking about religion, and I can speak only for Christianity because that's how I was brought up, is that the Old Testament is more of the authoritarian. You think of punishment, you think of discipline, you think of hierarchy, men over women, that kind of thing, strict authoritarian father. That's largely Old Testament, and New Testament tends to be more progressive. That's where you find the ideas of, do unto others, and that kind of thing. Blessed are the poor. So very much, very interesting. Very much biconceptual in terms of the Bible, and this kind of differentiation between authoritarian ideas in the Old Testament and progressive ideas in the New Testament. So yeah, great question. And then of course, poor people are way at the bottom. And of course, if you are a non-white poor person, it doesn't get much lower than that, because you have lacked discipline. There are religious people and organizations that really believe that if you are, let's say, an African American and you are a poor person, that you were born into those circumstances because God or whatever deity wanted you to be born there because of something bad that your family has done, and you have to gain discipline through the punishment and pain of your poverty so that you can become successful, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So yeah, so there's kind of the foundation of authority in the conservative frame. And you'll notice that there's a deep foundation for prejudice and racism there, that people are automatically fit into a specific place in the hierarchy just based on who they are. So there's a lot of precedent for that. And you talk about precedent, and these ideas have roots that predate a lot of our political principles. There's a Mayan social pyramid where you have this idea of a king or high priest that's way at the top, being very close to their deities, their god, and then you're kind of working your way down to the commoners and slaves who are at the bottom. And obviously the people who are higher up are wealthier, they have more privilege, they were viewed as more moral, more disciplined. So there's a lot of precedence for this going very, very far back through any culture, east, west, anywhere. So just as we could also, by the same token, find precedence for empathy. So, but this is just pointing out how deeply rooted these hierarchical authoritarian ideas are. So one of the things that I really believe became crystal clear in the last election is that there is a strong unconscious influence to this. And it had a massive cognitive effect on the electorate. Lakoff wrote a piece fairly early on talking about how Trump was changing people's brains. And I think that this unconscious influence aligns with that changing people's brains, because it has the effect of attracting people to a ruling class. Why? Because it is a response to being afraid. We'll get to a slide in a minute that shows kind of why that happens, the need for protection, the need to be kind of part of a group that is receiving privilege from the ruling class. So lots of psychological, cognitive influences there. It also provides this idea of a majority race, which obviously was attractive for and had a lot of influence on kind of middle white America, especially when you couple it with a narrative that you're being left behind. And then here comes this authoritarian figure, very high up on the hierarchy, because of wealth, because of privilege, that could lead you out of that situation and restore you to your majority type of privilege. It's found in both counter-revolutionary, as in this slide's a little far ahead, but it shows the attraction of the influence here. Counter-revolutionary to the ideas, the progressive ideas that have been forwarded in society very recently. For example, freedom to marry. That's a big one. For example, the focus on income inequality and things like that. So there are these for conservatives, revolutionary social and economic ideas coming to the fore, and this idea of authoritarian hierarchy is attractive because it provides a counter-revolutionary message to maintain the status quo for the ruling class and the majority race. And it can also be new, such as the Tea Party, right? So we see these authoritarian ideas, this hierarchy at play in the principles of the Tea Party. Very much a values-oriented movement. So it's found not just in counter-revolutionary, but also in new movements as well. And it is also unconsciously influential because it basically means that you are what's the word I'm looking for? Well, you're kind of pledging obedience to higher authority. Pledging isn't really the right word, but you're unconsciously giving up a certain amount of your free will in obedience to a higher authority. And that's, of course, ironic because conservatives like to talk about personal freedom, but you are definitely giving up some of that to obey a higher authority. So there's a lot of unconscious influence there that clearly played a role in the last election. I just have this up. It's a great read. It's called The Reactionary Mind. It's by Corey Robin, who is a professor at the Brooklyn College City University of New York Graduate Center, and she defines conservatism as defending power and privilege against movements demanding freedom and equality. And there are a lot of very poignant aspects of the book that are very consistent with our ideas of framing and how there's unconscious influence on people. So The Reactionary Mind, Corey Robin, really good read. And these ideas of hierarchy and authoritarianism are critical to the conservative worldview because there is a patent unconscious acceptance of the hierarchy. It is what the frame depends on, and it is critical to its survival. So to accept the hierarchy is absolutely critical, and it provides a need for protection and survival that people feel. It provides leadership, as in obeying an authority figure that will show you the way to prosperity as they have trod. And here's what's really important that a lot of people missed in the election is that the people who voted for Donald Trump saw themselves in the authority figure. They literally, unconsciously saw themselves in Donald Trump, what they aspired to, what they wanted to be. And it was consistent with their values. Which is why people were very ready to forgive the quote-unquote few things here and there that made Donald Trump look like a misogynist or a chauvinist or a racist, because they saw themselves in him as an authority figure, what they could aspire to be, and therefore you have the populist identity of authority being unconsciously given and obeyed. So I hope that makes sense. It's kind of deep, but it's really important, because what it means is that people are viewing themselves in Donald Trump, for people who voted for him and still support him. And that's a very powerful thing, because that means you can't just say Donald Trump's a bad guy. Because people then can respond, wait, but I see me and him and what I want to be, and I'm not a bad person. Right? That's a very common cognitive process there, kind of rationalization. So the foundation of conservative populism, as I mentioned, because conservative populism has to be what's going on here, and it's based on the hierarchy, the following of the authority figure, right? So the acceptance of Trump requires populism. So the people identify with him, so they're suffering in the hard school of adversity. And these are actually quotes from the book, which is really interesting because I think it's spot on, right? So people suffering in the hard school of adversity and attending the terrible school of misfortune, right? People view that as their discipline that they deserve, right? And it actually addresses the human capacity for error, right? Because you make a mistake and you suffer the consequences, and you take responsibility, and that is your adversity and misfortune that will make you a better and more prosperous person, as long as you follow the road paved by the authority figure. So, and of course, as you can see from Don's question, this is really very close to Old Testament stuff, right? I mean, you're seeing these ideas of God punishing people who are bad, so they don't do it again. That's very, very conservative thinking. But you see how powerful these ideas of populism are, and kind of what that's brought us to. And it really points to the idea that the way out can't be to attack a person. If people view that person as an authority figure they identify and see themselves in, and that the adversity that authority figure is going through is going to make them better, and as we're going to see shortly, it means something to the idea of freedom as well. And as I promised, I didn't have a preview of the slide up. That was a little bit of luck, but a little bit annoying what's coming up. So I'm going to take a quick little drink here. Let's see, Don. If you're entitled to a bailout from a storm, you're a rich person in a nice house. You're not if you're homeless. So that is a great comment. So first of all, let me approach that question. I'm going to put myself up on the screen here so you don't have to. That way you won't read ahead so much. So let me approach that from two aspects. So the first one, I'm going to approach from the conservative frame, and the conservatives would look at it, and first of all, the wealthy person is going to live in, more likely, a higher elevation, safer part of the city or county or state that's being inundated, because they will have been able to afford a better plot of land that's maybe not in the floodplain. So chances are they live in a better plot of land, higher elevation. Then they are going to have a stronger, more secure home that can withstand, let's say, a hurricane, because they have the money, because of their hard work and their discipline, and they've taken care of themselves, with their money. So they're going to have a much safer place to ride out the storm. And for the homeless people and the people who are poor that live in the terrible part of town that just kind of have a shack or a wooden home that's not so stable and secure, and maybe they have to live in a floodplain because that's all that is available or all they can afford, well, that's God punishing them. And you've heard, conservative religious people have said things like this, that they deserve it. So that's kind of the consequences of, the outcome of being hit by a hurricane and being rich and poor. And make no mistake, the wealthy person deserves to come out of it better than the poor person who doesn't. So that is clearly how they're going to think of it. Then from the flip side, there is a large group of conservative biconceptuals that would go to the rescue of people who are in need. So you see it in Mexico, you see it in Puerto Rico, you saw it in Houston, neighbor helping neighbor, people rushing to help others, putting together fundraisers, things like that. That is people's empathy. That is people, putting themselves in the shoes of those who were harmed, and, saying, I'm going to do something, I'm going to be with these people and help them and make sure that they have what they need because that's the right thing to do. Right? So there's really two ways to look at it. One is the conservative viewpoint, which would basically say one deserves to fare better than the other because of their moral position, their discipline, and then one that says empathy, we need to help people, this is the right thing to do, it's the morally right thing to help our neighbors and people in need. So there you go. And you can say, one is Old Testament, one's New Testament as well. So, really good question. So we get to find which, there we go. So we get back to the slide. Hope that answered the question. Good one. So what this means to freedom is, and remember, for conservatives, it's all about self-discipline. You have responsibility for yourself above others, and even at the expense of others. And this authoritarian father figure, high up on the hierarchy, shows the way to moral freedom, right? And that is self-discipline, right? So think of Old Testament, 10 Commandments. You obey these, you will have discipline, you will be successful, you will be blessed, and then the more free you will be, right? And what's most important of all is that this system is morally fair and just. This in and of itself is a moral system. This is not rational thinking time. You're not going to be able to reason with someone and point out facts that dispute this. This is a moral system. So when you obey, as the previous slide I talked about obeying the authority figure, so people who obey God, people who obey the authority figure, that leads to discipline, and that paves the way to success. And again, if you think in terms of religion being blessed, that's what that means. So the more disciplined you are, the more blessed and successful you are, the more free you are. Right? So when conservatives talk about freedom, and when they talk about issues where they talk about choice in education provides kids with opportunity, right? What does that mean? That means that the people who are the most successful and they choose their school, that provides them with more opportunities to be successful, so they should be more free as a result, right? And to them, that is a moral system that counters any kind of talk about test scores or the reality of which schools are more effective in educating kids in poverty. It counters all that because this is a moral system. So I hope that makes sense, because in this day and age it's really important that we start accepting the science of this, and that it is a moral system physically embodied in people's brains, and start addressing that. So what's critically important about this is that the progressive frame counters hierarchy. So how does the progressive frame counter hierarchy? So if you think about the progressive frame, hold on, I just gotta flip here we go. Okay. So the progressive frame counters hierarchy through empathy. All right, so we all know that the progressive frame is based on empathy. So how does... Okay. There we go. Okay, sorry about that little... There we go. Okay, sorry, I'm back. So empathy. We all know that empathy is at the foundation of the progressive frame. All right, so how does this counter the hierarchy? First of all, you have a responsibility for others as yourself, right? This is part of empathy. You've all heard this a lot. So it's also, here's the thing, it's also moral to act on your empathy. So, in other words, just like people who, we talked about hurricanes, earthquakes, you see a neighbor or a friend or a family member in need, you feel a compulsion to act. You don't have to think about it, you just do. So it is moral to act that way. So here we are, this is a different moral system. Okay? Empathy is necessary to private prosperity. Why is it necessary to private prosperity? Because think back to that Elizabeth Warren clip when she talks about how no one gets rich on his or her own. Right? The truth is that you cannot be prosperous without having connections from other people, and connecting and working with and being part of other people's lives. If you remove the important people from your life, you will be nothing. And So all of us acting on empathy to take responsibility for others is critically important to a prosperous society. So that should be pretty much self-explanatory. So here's what's important about that, right? So the more prosperous you are, then morally you have a greater responsibility to act on your empathy. Why? Because as somebody who's wealthy, you've received greater benefit from the public and people, which are basically one and the same. So hopefully that makes sense. So the progressive frame takes that hierarchy and actually levels it and says, no, the people who conservatives think are way up at the top have a greater responsibility to the public and to people because of the benefit they have received from others. And therefore, as Elizabeth Warren so correctly said, they have a responsibility morally to pay it forward to others. So that is how the progressive frame counters the authoritarian hierarchy, which is why it is so important to actually do that, to actually counter with the hierarchy. To counter with empathy. Counter the hierarchy with empathy. So, what does this mean for freedom? So, it means that if you have a moral responsibility to act on empathy, that means that because of the freedom you have responsibility for others' freedom, right? And you've heard me kind of say this a lot in the context of other blogs and messages and stuff like that. But it means that responsibility is a moral one. It is part of a moral system. And of course, the wealthier you are, the more responsibility you have. So if you are to have a very large amount of wealth, then you have a very large amount of responsibility for people, towards people who help put you in that position. So the truth that we need to start communicating to help evoke the progressive moral frame is the truth that the success that we all have and that people have depends on others. It's impossible to be that successful alone and have that much prosperity. And a good example of this is kind of the old movie It's a Wonderful Life, right? They took George Bailey out of other people's lives, and what happened? People were less prosperous. They were less free. They were less happy. So therefore, George felt, as he always had, especially after coming out of that experience, a very deep moral responsibility to act on that empathy and help others. So this idea is very important, that your success depends on others. And while that may not work with somebody like Donald Trump, and I think it's important to point this out, while it may not work with somebody like Donald Trump, or maybe a Ron Johnson, or a Paul Ryan, or somebody like that, who's really, really deeply physically embodying the conservative frame, what is really important to point out is that the average person, possibly even who voted for Donald Trump, will believe this. And this is something we can connect to our issues. So next slide. 1 second here. Go. So it's really interesting because in the second to last, so yesterday's Daily Dose, one of the comments on Facebook from somebody when I said that communicating values is the most important priority for progressives and Democrats. Somebody said no, the most important priority is to beat this Obamacare repeal. Okay, so in terms of an issue action, okay, that is, yes, that is a high priority. But my response was, so wait a minute. So you're going to keep playing whack-a-mole every time conservatives try to do something, then it's going to be the next big thing where it's the next end of the world scenario, or the next end of our nation scenario is going to be whatever the next conservative policy is, and then you're going to be doing the same thing, trying to attack that issue instead of having something progressive and positive for people to start believing and rallying in. Okay, so with that in mind, right, so this idea of freedom in terms of progressive values that we've talked about is everything on every issue, right? So if you look at an issue, it's about, which frame of freedom are we going to evoke, right? So on healthcare, right? Is it the conservative market idea where healthcare freedom is determined by the market, where it's determined by, discipline, success, and is deserved, right? So like Paul Ryan said, right? You get the healthcare you deserve, right? If you have a really good job, you're really successful, you get great healthcare. If you're not, not so great. Why? Because you deserve that, right? Is that freedom, or is healthcare what everyone needs to live free from want, fear, and to have a prosperous community, right? Two different views of freedom, based on two different moral systems, but I believe most people would agree that you need health care in order to be free from want and fear and to be free to live in a prosperous community, right? Because the more people that have health care in your community, the better off everybody is, right? It's more healthy, there's more people engaged in the economy, more people, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, so that's health care. What is it on education? Okay, we all know education, it's about personal choice, right? So the more disciplined you are, the more successful you are, you deserve a better school, right? And for people who want to make that personal choice to send those kids to those good schools, right, they deserve that, right? Or, here we go, flipping the frame again, or is education what everyone needs to live free from want? There's a misspell. Needs to live from want. Needs to live from want and fear, and to live in a prosperous community, right? Clearly, it's the latter. And then on the economy, right? So, in terms of the economy, right, we are deeply embedded in the conservative frame of the economy, where people who are successful are viewed as being moral and disciplined, and those who are not deserve their poverty. Because they need to get a job, they need to get a better job, they need to work harder, get two jobs, etc., etc. Right? And this is where I think we could do better as Democrats and progressives, is we should resist talking about an economy that quote unquote works for everyone, or that it gives hardworking families a fair shot, because that evokes this market frame. Talk about an economy that provides everyone what they need to live free from want and fear, and provides for freedom and a prosperous community for everyone. I mean, that's a very different way of looking at it than talking about hardworking families and hardworking people and gives people who, the Democratic line is, we want an economy that works for everyone and gives everyone a fair shot, right? I mean, you can see how that evokes the conservative frame after everything we've just talked about, right? So the market gives people a fair shot. Those who are successful have done well because they're disciplined. Those that don't, they got their fair shot. They weren't disciplined enough. Now they deserve their punishment so they can become more successful in the future, right? No. We need an economy that provides everyone what they need to live free from want and fear, and so they can live free in a prosperous community, right? That is a vision of the economy that is progressive. So there we go. So you can see freedom means everything to these issues, and there's a pattern here, right? The pattern says that you were dealing with a very powerful moral metaphor here, and it's a hierarchy, right? There is not a literal hierarchy in our society or in the world. There aren't people literally, classified and stacked up in a hierarchy, although sometimes maybe it appears that way when you look at demographics and where people live. But anyway, I was just thinking about Chicago. I mean, the north side is where all the wealthy people live. The south side is where the poor people are. There's a little bit in between here, but here and there. But it kind of is a geographic hierarchy. But it is metaphorical, and it's very powerful, and it's one that we all understand and accept. Right? So the only way to counter that is to not, you can't counter that with facts and figures and statistics about how much damage the hierarchy does. That doesn't work, because it does not counter a moral system. You need to counter a moral system with another moral system that is potentially better for everyone. And the way you do that is to get people to think of others as they think of themselves. And that's empathy, right? So this idea that, so if you have a good life, clearly other people have cared about your freedom, right? So isn't being a good person about caring for the freedom of others, right? Kind of this, people have cared about you, you have a moral responsibility to care about them. I think that's a message that the vast majority of people would accept and agree with. And then we have the opportunity to start branching out on the issues as I showed there, right? So, okay, so you're doing really well in the economy. Well, obviously other people cared about you since you're doing so well because you got a great education at a public school or a public university, and you work in a corporation that uses the corporate system that we all set up through the government, that provides your corporation with protection and empowers your corporation to make money, and we all did that, so you're welcome. And don't you have the responsibility to pay it forward and care about others? So lots of good talking points there. And this is something that I plan on continuing to explore through the Daily Dose. And I hope all of you will do the same, because I think it's a very, very powerful way of kind of communicating and countering what is, a really, really deeply ingrained moral system that, you see everywhere. And, just to underscore the point, when you, not saying you, all of you personally, but when someone tries countering this really strong moral hierarchy message, about discipline and hard work and what that means to freedom and your personal freedom, and the freedom of others, it's not going to be very effective to, just say, you're a bad person, or so-and-so is a bad person, or so-and-so hates puppies, or here are facts and figures about how this is not true, because it's a deeply ingrained moral system. The best tactic that we know now is to provide a better moral system that people can believe in, and how that will positively impact their lives and the people around them. So clearly, to say that it's morally good to care about the freedom of others because they've cared about your freedom, and act responsibly towards others as you want them to act towards you, and then what that relates to in terms of education and healthcare and the economy and infrastructure and et cetera, the list goes on and on. That gives people an opportunity to think about it differently and potentially act on it differently. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to start tearing down the hierarchy and getting more and more people to think in terms of progressive ideas and suppressing the more authoritarian ideas. And at the end of the day, that is a good way to actually start winning elections again. Because I just had an alert, and it's nobody asking a question. Sorry. So it's not a matter of just long term. This can have short term impact in terms of elections, because the vast majority of people are biconceptual. So find authentic candidates, communicate progressive values, talk about moral values and responsibility for others, and how we act on that. And I think that's critically important. So thank you all for being on. This will be, if there aren't any more comments or questions, not a lot of questions. Hopefully this will spur some thoughts and ideas, and feel free to email, communicate on the website, whatever. Hope you're enjoying the Daily Dose. They're a lot of fun to do, and getting some good feedback on them, so that'll continue. And refer a friend. So have a great night. Stay cool, everybody, and I will see you all very soon. Good night.